Hey guys, it's me. Don't hate me. I'm sorry I couldn't be there for you guys. But I just wanted to give you some extra stuff in case you needed to polish off some of your answers for the homework that's due tonight. So we ended last time in our notes with some epic stories. We talked about the Punic Wars and how Rome won all three of them and defeated Hannibal and the mighty city of Carthage, and that Rome went from owning the Italian peninsula to much of the lands that comprised of the western coasts in the Mediterranean world. And then, of course, that expansionist policy continued. That imperialist notion of Roman power and excellence continued, which began to take a toll on the Roman Republic itself. Again, this is a system where citizens elect representatives to policy and law, positions that they could talk about policy and law. And the more people that come under your rule, the more representatives you'll need, which can increase the length of the conversation, and then the effectiveness can decrease. So, the Roman Republic was beginning to be tested by expansion anyway, but that trigger of the Julius Caesar and the tension between generals and the Senate in gaining too much power would be pretty much the trigger of transition from republic to empire. And so after Julius Caesar is assassinated, Mark Antony and Octavian quarrel, and after Mark Antony goes through his death, Octavian takes over as Augustus Caesar, which then begins to centralize his power. So he is our first emperor, essentially, because Julius Caesar declared himself as a dictator. I mean, when you break it down, it's pretty much the same thing anyway. But logistics-wise, Augustus Caesar, who is a.k.a. Octavian, is our first emperor. And he centralizes his power, which means he centers himself around all other decisions. So what he starts to do is he, again, of course, expands the boundaries of the Roman Empire, and not under his rule, but eventually the Roman Empire will comprise land from the Iberian Peninsula all the way to the eastern parts of Palestine, which is present day like Israel, Southwest Asia. Anywho, we have a series of emperors which we'll talk about next time we see each other, but just on Octavian's note one more time. Octavian, who becomes Augustus Caesar, which I believe means greatness anyway. And by the way, if you haven't noticed, a lot of the emperors, or the terminology in the textbook, the rhetoric from Rome, much of that created some of the terms that we use in our calendar year, things like that. Anyway, so going back to Augustus Caesar, he centralizes his power, and with this power to make the decisions, he decides to create a police task force that enforces the laws beyond just what the army's doing, as far as, the army spreading out, gaining land and territory, creating roads. Now you have a police force who is enforcing the actual laws that people follow, like the 12 tables. They have a census for accurately collecting taxes. He creates a postal system, eases communication. He initiates many public works projects like aqueducts, building roads, bridges, and the army does a lot of that, but again, you're also getting ordinary citizens and slaves to help as well. Again, with schooling and education, it's open to both boys and girls, upper class, lower class. So we see overall an increase in education. And when you're honoring and valuing education, you see an increase in the ability to progress. Now look at our society, and I keep making you guys kind of think about where our society's at, because we do need to start talking about this. To what point do you feel our education system is performing? Does our society honor education? And does that honor or value that we have towards education, is that reflected in what we see in schools among students? That's a question for all of you to answer. Octavian will also, or Augustus Caesar will also station troops around trouble spots across the empire. And because of all of these great things, eventually what's going to happen is the Roman Empire is going to enter into this golden age called the Pax Romana. Yes, time of Roman peace. Now, I believe one of the emperors during the Pax Romana, Hadrian, will build this wall by the British Isles in Britain that was meant to protect the Romans from the barbarian tribes, and there were numerous barbarian tribes, especially towards the end of Rome's lifetime. But we know how much walls really do, work. Back then, they were definitely more effective in the fact that because they didn't have modern weapons. Today, walls really aren't necessarily the best tool at keeping out individuals that you do not desire to be interacting with. Here's our golden age. Just right away to the images we see, we have the Pantheon, different from the Parthenon of Greece. However, we do see Greco-style architecture here. We see the columns, correct? Right here, we see the columns. However, Rome takes that and adds to it. They have the dome here. In the aqueducts, they have arches. So where the Greeks are remembered for their columns, the Romans are remembered for their arches and their domes. And we see this in modern-day buildings today. Many of our political buildings, like the Capitol building in D.C., the White House, the Lincoln Memorial, even the C.J. Hooker School itself has columns. So, again, Rome does kind of copy Greece in this light. So it's gone from an extension of Greco-style architecture and government politics. So back to this time of Roman peace, a.k.a. the Pax Romana. Now, again, it's important to note that along with the fact that they were tolerant towards their conquered people, and again, up to a certain point, as long as they showed loyalty to the government by taxes and giving soldiers, the Pax Romana was a great period of time because they were funding public works, education was happening, trade was flourishing, it was vibrant, diversity was celebrated. They had the development of art and engineering. They were speaking and communicating with each other more easily. Latin was a very common language amongst the Mediterranean world. So, conversation was definitely something that was easily done. So trade also was more easily done with this language that was available to them. Aqueducts provided the availability and access to water so that actual people who lived within the city of Rome were able to obviously enjoy the ease of having water that was clean. You have the Pantheon, again, going back to that, outside of the architecture thing. The Pantheon was a celebration of the gods, and this was another way of the government giving back to the people, so that they had a house of worship for gods besides their own homes or temples they created at their home. They had the Colosseum, which has a retractable roof. This is me, this is my sister making fun of me, and my pose, and this is us in Rome. These are some of the remains of a Roman camp for the gladiators to practice that. It's adjacent to the Colosseum itself. This is the Roman Forum, where it was more like, they would have like a marketplace, or they would get together and talk philosophy and speak about law, gossip. It was like where it's kind of like the town square, so to speak, except it's a city and it was big. That's my husband pouring water on my sister without her knowing. Anyway, this is the Colosseum, as many of you know, and have it etched in your brain, because it is actually quite interesting. The Colosseum was a stadium that enabled people to enjoy entertainment that was aggressive and violent and bloody. They did reenactments of old battles that they valued and cherished as part of their Roman heritage. They did gladiator games. They most of the races were at the Circus Maximus, which I'll get to in a moment. But again, look at the architecture of the Roman Colosseum. You have the arches here. Again, that's very, very Romanesque. And if you look inside the Colosseum, this was the stage, so to speak, and underneath it were all of, like, the trap doors where the animals were kept, because they were able to open up certain parts of the floor, and the animals would come up. Now, this concept of bread and circuses, and this is in your homework, I believe. Bread represents food, circuses represent entertainment. So, essentially, the philosophy was, as an emperor, if you kept the people fed just enough, and you entertained them just enough to where they were distracted, they would ignore the major issues going on in the government that were either corrupted or insufficient or inefficient. So these events were mostly free, which meant, you know, most times the people who had to pay were the ones who really couldn't afford too much. And then we see that the upper classes were rewarded with better seats. So if a woman was coming to this who was of lower class, they'd be at the very, very highest part of the Colosseum. The Circus Maximus seen here below is where they had chariot races, or they even had something where it was like outrun the mob, and that's when a prisoner was forced to run away from the mob who was trying to kill him and disembowel him. Just some really, really crude stuff. So, I mean, these were things that they were cheering for, that were entertaining. These were the things that excited them, watching people suffer and die, and not even in a peaceful way, just a violent thing. And I know we've talked about this in comparison to today, so I won't go too much into that. Again, this is another view of the Colosseum. This is Circus Maximus today. Notice there's nothing there. It's just an open field. I think people gather there for New Year's Eve now. That's pretty much all it's used for, but it's pretty dirty. Speaking of dirty, this is where the public baths were. Yes, public baths. There were men's areas, women areas, and it was like getting together, social, another area or avenue for socialization to occur. I think we spoke briefly about this, that as the soldiers expanded, they built their roads, and many of those roads, because they came from Rome, connected to Rome. And then last but not least, you don't necessarily have to write this down. I just put this here to give you a timetable as to how Rome is working out. So Rome had a steep incline of great things occurring. You know, they acquired vast amounts of land through their expansionist policies, their Punic Wars, and their successful generals and their ability to acquire land. The turning point here was when Augustus takes over as emperor and centralizes his power. And there's a period of Roman peace here, Golden Age. The unfortunate part is towards the end of the Pax Romana, you'll see a series of very, very corrupt emperors. They increase taxes. They have parties. The morality of society begins to deteriorate. Relationships between men and women start to change a little bit, as far as what marriage means and the value in that. And I mean, there's a couple emperors that really just do some horrible things, and that's where the bread and circuses really, really became all the more important. So while certain emperors were committing outright murder towards particular groups of people, others ignored it because at least they were being fed and they themselves were taken care of and not being attacked or targeted. And just think about that, even in today's standards, certain groups of people do get targeted, do get attacked, and the majority, or people who are not being attacked or targeted or discriminated against, either say it's not happening or it's not a big problem, so they choose to kind of let it go or ignore it. But then when it happens to them, it's a little bit of a different issue. And we could see this down to the level of you guys in the high school. Many of these things we're going to talk about as we talk about the fall of many other civilizations and empires. But with that being said, the lesson is over. I will see you on Monday. Have a great weekend, and good luck with doing your homework or doing an extra credit sheet. Or not an extra credit sheet, just a sheet.